Thank you very much, Ken, and thanks to WIDA for putting this on. I think obviously it's an important birthday to be recognizing. I want to also give a shout out to my very good friends, Ambassador Tim Grosser, who I worked with together both in Geneva and here in Washington on these things. And of course, Susan Schwab, she and I worked together in the Congress during the days of the '88 Trade Act when we were deciding how to give the U.S. government the authority to try to negotiate a change in the system. I remember at that time, I think it was 1987, Lester Thoreau going to Davos, and a big headline showing up in the paper the next day, GATT is dead, because he predicted that this was the end of the multilateral system. A lot of people have been predicting that sort of thing for a long time, but of course it turned out he was right. The GATT did sort of disappear. We don't talk about the GATT anymore because the WTO was created out of the Uruguay round. But of course, most of the basic principles and visions, and in fact, the legal provisions of the WTO are still there, and some pretty amazing ideas and principles that the post-war architects of the system created to be able to accomplish an architecture for trade liberalization and for a fairer and more just trading system. And if you think about these principles like MFN and national treatment, as well as more of the non-tariff rules that we've all worked on over the years, and now added services to that and intellectual property and other things, it's a pretty amazing accomplishment, a pretty amazing evolution. I do like to point out to people that with all the frenzy of bilateralism and free trade agreements and all the rest, it's important to remember for the U.S., for example, our 10 largest trading partners, 7 of those relationships still rely on the rules of the GATT WTO system and not FTAs, and some pretty big ones like our relationship with China and with Europe and with Japan. And so MFN is still important, a principle like national treatment, which really prevents countries from replacing any kind of commitments they make on trade with discriminatory laws and regulations. But, you know, tonight's maybe not a night to try to sell the system to you, other than to talk a little bit about why those of us who spend a good deal of our life working on this both are proud and vexed by many of its accomplishments and also contradictions. I was looking back on, John Jackson's great book, World Trade and the Law of GATT. He had this great quote at the beginning from a Senator Eugene Milliken, who I guess was a senator from, I think, Nebraska in the early 50s, who said, "Anyone who reads GATT is likely to have his sanity impaired." I think a lot of us would share that. I remember a famous quote from the first Director General of the GATT, Eric Wyndham White, who said, when asked to describe the GATT, he said, "Well, it's a series of loopholes tied together with waivers." Now, obviously, we've improved on that over the years, but as you all know, there's still kind of a lot of interesting stuff in there. Certainly full employment for many of us in this room who've spent years and years trying to figure out how to work the system. I mean, for me, obviously, this is a nostalgic event because, spent a lot of years working on the negotiations with others in this room, and a lot of interesting and fun experiences. I just want to end by giving you 2 little, anecdotes of my experience in the system. I went there as the U.S. ambassador to the GATT right after we passed the 1988 Trade Act, and in fact, Carla Hills was the new USTR. One of the things under the 88 Trade Act was Super 301, and we just made the designations, the first 3 designations of our target countries under Super 301. I think it was Brazil, Japan, and India. And a week after I arrived, with all this hope and optimism of how fun it was going to be to represent the U.S. in the GATT, John Weeks of Canada, who's here, was the chairman of the General Council at that time. The first meeting I had to go to was a special meeting of the GATT Council called to condemn the United States for its Secret 301 designations and its escape from multilateralism. So that was kind of a baptism of fire. I eventually got used to representing the U.S. in the system. I remember very much, after I'd been there about a year, I sat next to Julio Lecarte, a great man of the system, of both the GATT and the WTO, had a lot to do with the Uruguay round and writing both the dispute settlement understanding and the WTO agreement, the institutional features. Lecarte was kind of a giant for all of us because he'd actually been in Havana at the Havana Charter negotiations. He was on the Uruguayan delegation. So he really went way back. And I got to sit right next to him. So I got an awful lot of great wisdom from my next door neighbor. But I remember once after being that about a year and a half, I don't know, we'd gotten into a fight with Colombia about something Colombia was doing. And I got instructions from my capital to go after the Colombians in the General Council. So after the Colombians had complained about the U.S., I turned to Lecarte and I said, I'm going to really attack this guy. I'm going after him. I've got instructions. I'm going to go after him. Lecarte looks at me and says, I wouldn't do that if I were you. And I said, no, I feel like that's my obligation. I'm going to do it. So I raised my flag. In those days, well, I guess we still do it. Put up your flag if you want to speak. So I put up my flag and I attacked them. And I thought my intervention was brilliant, utterly brilliant. As soon as I finished, like 45 flags went up all over the room. Every Latino, plus a lot of their friends, plus of course the Europeans couldn't help but pile on. And pretty soon I was facing just, another episode of attacks on the U.S. And I turned to Lecarte and I said, wow, that was something. I said, you're right. And he looked at me and said, you haven't seen the worst of it yet. I said, what do you mean? He takes his flag and... Anyway, thank you, Ken, for putting on this event. I'm sure it could go on all night, but it's great to see all you. This is a pretty enduring system that's been built, and with all its flaws and all its problems, it's still extremely important to the United States. So I hope we can all stay engaged as we deal with the challenges of the future. Thanks again for having me, man.